Hello Dragons, and welcome to this instructional video for Lesson 9 Part 6, Fiscal Policy and the Federal Budget. The main idea behind this economics lesson is all governments develop budgets to help them plan revenue and the amounts and direction of expenditures. With that in mind, by the end of watching this video, you'll be able to explain how the federal budget is developed, identify what role deficit spending plays in the economy, and describe the methods that government can use to balance the federal budget. Now that the outcomes for this lesson have been shared with you, let's get started. How do you spend your money? To identify how much you spend on food, clothing, and entertainment, you might keep a record known as a budget. Similarly, businesses and governments also plan how and when to spend funds. You have learned that for fiscal policy to be effective, it must work with monetary policy. Additionally, fiscal policy must fit the government's spending plan. The federal budget is the federal government's plan for the use of government revenues. This budget details government revenues and expenses and predicts any shortfalls. In effect, the federal budget summarizes the ways in which the government uses fiscal policy. Why does the United States have a federal budget? Before the Civil War, the United States had no formal process for planning future revenues and expenditures. The various federal departments simply requested funds as needed. After the mid-1800s, however, three developments, wartime spending, increased corruption, and progressive reform, encouraged the creation of an orderly budgeting process. Wartime spending caused dramatic increases in the level of government expenditures. For example, federal spending for all programs was just $63 million in 1860. The year before the Civil War began. By 1865, the final year of the war, federal spending had jumped to over $1 billion, more than 16 times the pre-war level. As noted in Lesson 6, the federal government historically has increased in size during a war and remained large after the war. Similarly, federal spending generally remains high after a war. As government officials discovered after the Civil War, this new, higher level of government spending required a more formal system of money management. A second factor favoring the creation of an orderly federal budget process was political and financial corruption. During the late 1800s, public officials were frequently bribed by individuals seeking government contracts or other favors. People came to believe that a federal budget would reduce financial and political corruption. Third, the development of the federal budget was spurred by the general spirit of reform during the progressive movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Progressives like President William Howard Taft worked to make government more accountable to the public and believed that centralized decision-making would permit federal resources to be used more efficiently and fairly. These leaders believed that a formal budget would contribute to that goal. In response to these factors, in 1921, Congress passed the Budget and Accounting Act. This legislation created the Bureau of the Budget and empowered the President to formulate an annual federal budget and present it for Congress's approval. In 1971, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, a part of the executive branch, replaced the Bureau of the Budget and was charged with putting together the President's budget proposal. Further budgetary reforms passed in 1974 established a process for the federal government to follow when creating a budget. How is the federal budget created today? First, the budget is developed by the President, who consults with the OMB, the Council of Economic Advisers, the Department of the Treasury, and other presidential advisors. Although the budget may predict revenues and expenditures for several years, it focuses on the next fiscal year. A fiscal year is a 12-month financial period that typically does not duplicate the dates of the calendar year. After the President has prepared the budget, it is analyzed by Congress. Once the budget has been examined and approved by both houses of Congress, it is returned to the President for signing. By the time the budget is returned to the President, many changes may have been introduced. The President may sign the budget if the changes are acceptable, or otherwise may veto it, requiring the process to continue. This circle graph provides a breakdown of the 2019 federal budget. In most years since the 1930s, increases in federal spending were not matched by increases in government revenues. In fact, in the years 1990 to 1994, spending exceeded revenues by more than $200 billion annually. When the government spends more money than it collects, a budget deficit occurs. Economists use the term deficit spending to refer to the government policy of spending more money for its programs than it is able to cover with its revenues. Deficit spending has increased dramatically since 1969, the year of the last federal budget surplus. Deficit spending averaged $5.3 billion a year in the 1960s, $36.5 billion a year in the 1970s, and $156.5 billion a year in the 1980s. In 2020, the budget deficit reached nearly $3.1 trillion, largely due to the COVID pandemic. The budget deficit was $984 billion just the year before. Why has the government relied on deficit spending? First, national emergencies such as wars frequently have caused an urgent need for vast spending increases. Second, in providing public goods, the federal government has used deficit spending for social programs. A third reason the federal government has used deficit spending is to stimulate the economy during recessions. During a recession, the federal government may decrease taxes and increase spending, thereby putting money into the economy. This process, however, further increases the deficit. The fourth reason for budget deficits has been the federal government's efforts to promote the economic well-being of its citizens. A budget surplus, on the other hand, occurs when the government revenues exceed government expenditures during the fiscal year. What happens when you spend more money than you earn? To cover your costs, you will probably need to borrow money. Similarly, to pay for deficit spending, the federal government must borrow money. The national debt is the total amount of money that the federal government has borrowed and includes all deficits from previous years. Under the U.S. Constitution, the federal government assumed all outstanding debts of the Confederation Congress. In 1790, the national debt was about $75 million. During George Washington's administration, the government first decided to sell government securities, a money-raising method that is still used today. Since Washington's presidency, the national debt has risen and fallen. Sometimes federal budget deficits have increased the size of the national debt, and sometimes budget surpluses have reduced it. The national debt passed the $1 billion mark for the first time during the Civil War. In 1917, the year the United States entered World War I, the national debt was just under $3 billion. 2 years later, the debt had climbed to more than $25 billion. Since World War II, the national debt has continued to increase steadily. In 1982, it topped the $1 trillion mark, and doubled again within 4 years. By 2021, the national debt had reached more than $28 trillion. Public concern about the size of the national debt has led Congress to approve debt ceilings. A debt ceiling legislates the limit on the size of the national debt. The debt ceiling of $11 billion approved during World War I was soon abandoned because of the government's need for additional credit. In 1918, the national debt increased to $12.5 billion, and by 1919, this debt had doubled. The national debt continued to rise, and in 1986, Congress raised the debt ceiling to $2 trillion. By 2021, the debt ceiling had been raised even higher, to $28.5 trillion. Is the U.S. economy helped or hindered by the national debt? Some economists argue that the benefits achieved from deficit spending and the resulting rise in the national debt exceed the cost. They note that government spending on social programs improves the quality of life for many people. Other economists argue that the short-term and long-term economic costs of the debt are severe. For example, in 1995, the federal government paid more than $232 billion in interest on the national debt. These economists argue that annual deficits in the national debt should be reduced so that money used for interest payments could be spent on programs such as national defense, road construction, and education. The high federal deficits and the rapid rise of the national debt have caused many policymakers to look for ways to balance the federal budget so that expenditures will not exceed revenues. The two ways to balance the budget are to increase revenues and to decrease expenditures. Some policymakers believe that a balanced budget should be required by law. The main tool that the federal government uses to increase revenues is taxation. Many politicians are reluctant to raise taxes because voters rarely want to give more money to the government. In some cases, tax increases may prove unavoidable, however, and Congress passes legislation that changes tax rates and tax brackets. For example, President Bill Clinton signed the 1993 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, which raised individual income tax rates for people in the highest tax bracket. The act also raised taxes on gasoline and provided a number of tax incentives. Another way the federal government can balance the budget is by decreasing spending. For example, during the early 1990s, a number of U.S. military bases were closed to help reduce spending on national defense. Similarly, of all orders for new aircraft in 1985, about 65% were placed by the federal government. By 1993, that number had dropped to 48%. Despite government actions to increase revenues and decrease expenditures, the remedies did not succeed in bringing federal deficits under control during the 1980s and early 1990s. One proposal, the Balanced Budget and Deficit Reduction Act of 1985, also called the Gramm-Rudman Act, set up a program to balance the budget within 5 years. This law required automatic cuts to nearly every government program if the budget deficit exceeded a certain amount. Although the deficits did decline between 1987 and 1989, the Gramm-Rudman deficit targets proved unachievable. A recession in 1990 and 1991 resulted in increased deficits once again. In response, more lawmakers began to call for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, requiring the government to develop and enact balanced budgets. So that's the way it is with Lesson 9, Part 6, Fiscal Policy and the Federal Budget. At this point, you should know that the budget is developed by the President, which is then analyzed by both houses of Congress. Federal spending has grown significantly, and deficit spending has caused greater increases in the annual budget deficits. and some citizens and policymakers believe that an amendment should be added to the Constitution, requiring the federal government to have a balanced budget. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to have the entire catalog of economics videos available at your fingertips. Click the subscribe button and then click the follow bell to receive notifications as to when the channel is updated. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in class, Dragons!